What's going on? So here's a script I prepared earlier. This one here, align, oopsies, oh no, what have I done? Align clips across tracks. So what this is intended to do, I've got these different types of sound effects, swells, hits, and pads, kind of musical, ethereal-y sound effects. And if I click a run on this fella, hopefully it's sort of obvious what it does. It aligns the clips on the 3 tracks in groups with the same start point. So I suppose the utility of this sort of thing is if you've got many different layers of one type of Foley or one type of sound effect or one type of sound, and you want to try different mixtures of those, like I've got 3 swells and many hits and many pads, and I want to hear what they all sound like in groups of 3. You can easily align them with this script. So cool, and then you keep editing, maybe you bring this one down, for instance, but yeah. The idea is that you quickly sort of mash them together and align them vertically. All right, let's get into it. There we go. Back to where it began. I'm going to delete the temporary one. All right, I'm going to start fresh. So new action, new rear script. Align items. Align items vertically. Align items across tracks to a grid interval. I have real trouble naming these things, don't I? If you can think of a better name for yours, please name yours better than mine. So like always, we have our instructions in a function called main, and then we actually call it at the bottom of the file. And I'm going to start, like always, just talking through the steps of what we're going to do to achieve this thing, just in comments, and then we're going to translate from comments to code. All right. Now, just briefly, I didn't mention this before, but the intention of this script is to only work on whatever you have selected, because you don't want to move all the items in a session. That might be annoying. Maybe you just want to align, these 3. You just want to align 3 items. So you should be able to do that. So I'm going to do it by the item count. So first, count the number of selected items. And if number of selected items is 0, then do not proceed. Right? We've done that a few times now in our scripts. That's starting to become somewhat commonplace, isn't it? Cool. So, provided that we have at least some items selected, what are we going to do? Well, first of all, how we want the functionality to be is we want everything to align to the starting position of the leftmost item. For instance, if the items were like this, what we want from our script, let's say the items are like this before we run the script, then when we run the script, this one should snap to here to align with the orange, and this one should snap to here to align with this one. So that's one thing. So everything should pivot around the leftmost item. That's point number 1. Point number 2 is we don't want to end up with any overlapping items like this, because that's messy and annoying. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at all the items selected and ascertain what the longest item length in that group is. Okay, and then we're going to make sure that our interval is a little bit greater than that, so there's always a gap in between the items. Figure out which, not which item, but figure out what the largest length is in this group of items. So figure out the largest length. That's one thing we need to do. And then we're going to store that value as a variable. Okay. We also need to figure out what the leftmost position is in our group of items. And we will store that as a variable as well. Cool. Now we can do this in a for loop. Do the following in a for loop. So we've talked about for loops before. And that's just a note for later. That's how we're going to facilitate that step. Cool. So by the time we get to here, we will know our leftmost position. We'll know the longest item length. So then our grid interval is going to be a little bit larger than our lengthiest item, right? So, you know, longest length plus 1 or plus 0.5 or something like that. Once we build the script, you could tweak the value to be what you feel is like a good minimum gap. Cool. So we've got our grid interval. We've got our leftmost position. That's good. And now for each item that we have selected, we want to get a reference to that item. Get a reference to the track that it is sitting on, and then get the track index of that track. Right? So, you know, these tracks have an index number. I think from memory it's a little bit different to how selected items work. There's some extra rules in place. We actually don't really need to know what those rules are. We just need to get the number. So yeah, part of our for loop is we're going to get the track index of that track. And what we're going to do with that is use the track index to figure out if this item, when I say this item, it's the item that we're talking about in that iteration of the loop. Use the track index to figure out if this item is on the same track as the item before, meaning the item that we looked at in the previous iteration of the loop. If we are on the same track as previous item, then so we're going to have jumping around a bit, we're going to have a running index. Increase our running index by 1. If that's not super clear what I mean by that, I will talk about that in just a moment. Yeah. However, if we are now on a different track than the previous item, running index will now equal 1. So we go back to 1. And what that is going to achieve for us is, you know, as it's going to move through the for loop, it's going to start on the top track. So it's going to align those as it will, right? And then we've run out of green tracks. We're now onto the orange tracks. Then in the for loop, when we're looking at this one, it's going to realize that it's a different track now. So that running index is going to go back to 1, meaning that it's going to snap to here. Because if we didn't do that step, this would snap over here, which is the functionality of one of our previous scripts that we did. But the functionality of this script is we want them to stagger on top of each other, align on top of each other. So that's what that step here is doing with that running index thing. All right, cool. So now, so the position that we will move this item to will be, so it's going to pivot around the leftmost item position plus grid interval multiplied by running index. Okay. So each time we go to a different track, running index resets. And actually, we want to reset it to 0, not to 1. Because then when you do grid interval times 0, this whole thing will be 0. So each time we go to a new track, it's going to put it on the leftmost position. So they're all going to pivot around the leftmost position. So that's going to reset to 0. So grid interval times running index, that's going to be the position. And then we move the item. And I think that's it. I think that will cover it. If there's any steps that I've missed, they will reveal themselves. But yeah, let's get into it. So count the number of selected items. So count selected media items. We've seen this a couple of times before. All right. So it's a function that returns an integer. So we'll call this num of selected items. And we pass in a reference to the active project, meaning the one that we have on screen. Now, I've talked about this in other videos. This will work if you just write 0. 0 is the index of the active project. But like I've talked about previously, what I usually like to do is make a variable called active project, assign it a value of 0, and pass that in instead. So in terms of functionality, that's exactly the same. But what I'm achieving here is just making the code a little bit more readable, which is always a good thing. So now we check that this value that we've just found out is greater than 0. So if number of selected items is greater than 0, then we proceed. And what I mean by proceed or not proceed is that we are putting the rest of the script inside of this if statement. So and we need an end to end that if statement. So if we've got more than one or more selected items, then we do all this stuff. But if number of selected items is 0, then it skips this whole block. It'll just go to here and then to the end, and then the script finishes and nothing would have happened. And it should be pretty obvious to the user why nothing happened. So we don't need to make any message or anything like that. You can make alert boxes saying like warning, no items selected, or whatever. I don't think that's super necessary, and it just sort of slows down the user, I tend to think. So I choose not to do that. Okay, so we've done our initial check, so that's good. So, and now we're going to do this. So we're going to, in a for loop, figure out. So what we're doing is we're going to make a for loop for as many times as there are selected items. Now, this is something we've done in a previous video. And the way that we've been writing this is for I equals 0 until number of selected items minus 1 do. And then everything between the do and the end is the set of repeated instructions that's going to happen for as many times as there are selected items. Now, the reason why we go from 0 to items minus 1 rather than going from 1 to number of selected items is that we use the I value as the index value. Because remember, the way that Reaper indexes things, when you select these 6 tracks here, these green ones, these 6 items, these green ones, the indices are 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's 0 to 5. So that's why we do I equals 0 to number of selected items minus 1. There are different ways to do that. I think it's probably good if you stick to the same way in all of your scripts rather than doing a different way. But there are definitely other ways to manage this thing. But anyway, let's stick with this method. All right, so what do we want to do? We want to figure out what the largest length in this group of items is. Okay, so we're going to get a reference to this item, the item with this index. Get selected media item. There we go. It's a function that returns a media item reference. And we're going to call that local item. We pass in the active project, and then we want to tell it which index we're looking at. So that's going to be I. Okay. Get the length of this item. So with that one, we've also done this before. Get medium item info value. Now we've seen this a few times. This is one where you pass in a media item reference and you pass in one of these parameter names as a string, and you can query a bunch of different things about it. In the past, we've looked at position, we've looked at length, and those are the things we're going to look at today as well. So I don't know why I said it like that. But yeah, let's grab this. Get the length of the item. So local length equals, pass in a reference to the item. And now the parameter name is d_length. And it has to be capitals. I assume it has to be capitals. I've never actually tried it without. But yeah, just do capitals. Get a length for this item. Now we also need to get the position of this item. So that's going to be basically the same as this. It's going to be, instead of d_length, it's going to be position. All right, so what we're doing here is we are figuring out which of these items is the leftmost item, and also which is the longest, which has the greatest length, duration, whatever. So we're looping through all the selected items and we're getting these values, but we need to figure out a way to actually compare them to one another. At the moment, what's happening is we're making these values, we're getting a reference, we're getting these numbers, but then in each iteration, these numbers are disappearing because they're local variables and they get replaced by the next item iteration. So we need some sort of running total. What I mean by running total is like each time we go through the loop, if we are now looking at the longest so far, we need to remember that length. And also, if we're looking at the leftmost one so far, we need to remember that position. So how we're going to achieve that is we create these new variables before the for loop. So they're going to be leftmost position and largest length, right? Then what we're going to do is compare this length with the largest length so far, right? And if, I'll write this, and if this length is greater than largest length so far, this length is now, no, largest length so far is now this length. So that way, as we keep going through the loops, each time we get the new largest, we remember that. And then we keep going, and if we hit another largest one, that's the new largest. And then eventually we'll get to the end of all the, we'll reach this number, and we already have our largest. Does that make sense? And then the same for the position. We're going to keep comparing with the leftmost. If the iteration is now on a new leftmost item, that's now the most leftmost. Getting lost in my words here. Hopefully this makes sense. So the way that I usually do this sort of thing is I usually initialize these values with some sort of outrageous number. For instance, and what I mean by outrageous is, we initialize this to a very small value such that on our first iteration through the loop, this length is now the largest length. Okay? And then when we check the second, we're comparing it to the first. And either it's larger or it's not, and then so on and so forth. So what I'm going to do with that is largest length is going to start at 0. And then straight away, our first item will beat that. So that's the new largest length. Okay, so if length is greater than largest length, then largest length is length. So after the first iteration, this will be the length of the first item. Because this starts off as 0, presumably the first item is longer than 0. I don't know if it's possible to have an item of 0 duration. Maybe it is, but anyway. Cool, so we need an outrageous value for our leftmost position. Now in Lua, there's a way to get the biggest number, and that is math.huge, which is kind of funny. So this will give you the largest number possible within this system. Different data types have limits to them, and this will be the upper limit. And I forget what it is, but it's a huge, huge number. You'll never beat it in a Reaper session, let's put it that way. You will never have this value on a timeline. I assume it's not possible. I mean, maybe it is, anything's possible, right? But for all intents and purposes, you're never going to be to the right of this. So the purpose of doing it like that is you know, we've got our position of this item, and then when we compare to leftmost position, on the first iteration, this item will definitely be to the left of this maximum number. So our first item that we're looking at through this list will now be the leftmost item. So we update leftmost position to be pos. Cool. So after we iterate through, we now have good values for these two things. And because these are initialized outside of the for loop, they're still going to be in scope. So once we get to this end of the for loop, those two variables will still exist in memory, which is something that we need because we're going to keep using these, right? All right, so now we're on to our next one. So what are we doing? We've already done this. That's what we just did. Right. So now our grid interval, right. So our grid interval is going to be a bit longer than our lengthiest item. So local grid interval is going to be largest length plus, I'm going to go 0.5. You can, once we finish it, we can adjust that value to be how you would want it to be, but that will at least make sure that there's always a gap. Cool. Very good. So now for each item that we have selected, get a reference. So this is to do with figuring out what track we're on and finally moving the item. So now we're going to do another one of these for loops. It's basically going to be the same to begin with. So we get a reference to this item. Oops. We do some of the same things and then we deviate off. Get a reference to the item. Right now, get a reference to the track that we're on. All right. So this get track media item value, that's the one that we're going to use here. So we will need that one. Get track media value. And for this one, we're going to use the IP track number. So that's the track index I was talking about before. So that gets passed in there as a string. This is going to be track. But we still need to get the track. Dropping the ball on that one a little bit, aren't I? Come on, Dave, get it together. Get track. No, we've already looked at that one. Get media item track. Yes. Jesus. All right, get media item track. So you pass in a media item and it returns a reference to the track that it is on. Nice. All right, so local track is going to be get media item track. We pass in item. All right. So use the track index to figure out if this item is on the same track as the item before. So this concept is going to be somewhat similar to what we did before. You know, we initialize a value before the for loop. Sorry, we initialize a variable before the for loop, and then we use that to compare each time we run through. So, what do we call it? Previous item track index, right? So remember, if you just write local and then a variable name, it initializes to a nil value. So I think that's going to work for our needs here, because what we're going to do is, if track index is the same as previous item track index, now we also need a running index, so that's going to be a variable that we initialize outside of the for loop as well. And we'll start off at 0 with that one. So if track index is the same as previous item track index, then running index increases by 1. However, if track index is not the same, remember the tilde equals means not the same. If it's not the same as previous track index, then running index returns to 0, and then we start counting again if there are more items on that new track. Now, just a quick aside about how I initialize this as nil. And you could literally write nil if you want. This is the same as just leaving it like that. But to make it a bit more readable, you can write equals nil if you prefer. That's fine. So let's just evaluate what's going to happen on the first iteration. So this starts off as nil, right? We get an item, get the track index, and now this will have a real value. And on the first iteration, it's comparing track index with nil. So this is going to be false. So we do not increment running index. This, however, will be true because track index is not the same as previous item track index. So then it sets it to 0. So what I'm getting at here is how we've structured it now is going to work for the first iteration. So now that we've used the track index for what we needed to do, now we can update previous track index for use in the next iteration. And all I mean by that is this equals track index. So then the next time around the loop, this has potentially a different value that it's being compared to here. Okay, if the item's on the same track, that's what we just did. Nice. If we are on the same track, increment or return to 0, that's what we just did. Nice. Excuse me. The position will now be this item, leftmost item plus grid interval times running index. Awesome. So new position will be leftmost position plus, I'm scrolling up because I need to make sure that the spelling of these things is correct. Grid interval times running index. Nice. All right, and then we move the item. set media item position. There we go. We've done this before. It returns a Boolean indicating whether it worked or not, but we don't need to use that, so we're just going to choose not to assign the return value to anything. So we're looking at just the item. Number position will be this new position. And refresh UI, if you remember what that does, if this is true, then as it's iterating through the loop, the screen, the session will update, which is probably what we want. You know, this script is going to happen very fast. It's not very complex. So even if you've got like 80 items selected, they're all going to move seemingly instantaneously. So everything's going to move to where it's moving instantly. I suppose if you were doing this script on like, you know, 8,000 items, maybe to speed up the process, you could set this to false. Yeah. And you know, like I've been talking about before, you could just write true, but then the downside of doing that is in a month's time when you're looking at this script, you know, it's not obvious what this true refers to. So what I usually like to do is make a variable, give it a value of true, and now it's really clear to see what's going on. It's like, oh, okay, the third item is the refresh, and refresh is true. Really easy to read. Cool. And we need to end that for loop. You know, the reason why I knew that that needed to be done is because I've been very meticulous with the alignment of the code. So it's really clear to see that this for does not have an end at the end. Yeah, so, you know, please be as careful as I am being with the alignment of your code, because it helps troubleshooting. Even though it doesn't actually make any functional difference to how the code performs, the computer doesn't care if you do this or whatever. It does not make a lick of difference. But for us, it does. For the human reader, it does. All right, so we might be done. I say might because, you know, you shouldn't always expect things to work perfectly the first time. But let's give it a go. Nope. Attempt to compare nil with number. Oh, sorry, you can't see that. There it is. Attempt to compare nil with number. All right. Length greater than largest. Largest large. Yeah, good on you. So that's highlights one of the things. There is always a risk when you type things out. It's much better to copy and paste things, because then you don't do stuff like that. Just quickly, so that error, you know, this said largest large. Largest large is not defined anywhere on this page. And when you try and compare two values, it needs to be a value that exists. You can't compare with nil, which is what the error was. Oops. Largest length. Okay, so now let's try again. Hey, nice. That's so satisfying. We'll try again. And there we go. Very cool. So yeah, this is a script that a version of a script that I use really quite often when I'm layering things. If you've got like heaps of options of things and you just want to smash them together and hear how they sound and then start editing from there, it's a really, really useful one. All right, so last thing to do is give it a, well, you don't have to do this, I guess, but I like to give this a shortcut. So this is going to be whatever that is. I have some macros set up, so yeah, apparently that's what the macro ends up being. You can assign it to whatever you want. But there's a reason why I do that, but it's not worth sharing because it's well, you'll probably think I'm crazy. So let's just leave it there. But there we go. That's my macro. That's the shortcut, and that's the script. Cool. So I hope you found that useful, and I will see you in the next one.